The debt was $43,000. Ruth Callahan had known about it for 9 months, which was the length of time between the morning she found the file in her husband's desk and the morning she drove to the office of a man named Howard Sinclair to settle what her husband had owed him. She had found the file on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after Daniel died. When she was going through the paperwork in his desk the way a widow goes through paperwork, systematically and without pleasure, looking for the documents that needed to be found and hoping not to find anything that would require a different kind of processing. The file was in the second drawer under a folder of car insurance documents, a thin manila folder with Howard Sinclair's name written on the tab in Daniel's handwriting, and inside it a promissory note signed by Daniel in 2019 for $43,000 at a modest interest rate, with a repayment schedule that Daniel had clearly not kept. The last payment marked on the schedule being 14 months ago. Ruth had sat at Daniel's desk with the file in her hands for a long time that Tuesday morning. She thought about asking Daniel what this was, the reflexive and irrational thought that arrives when you have spent 31 years asking someone things and the habit has not yet learned that it no longer has a recipient. She thought about the money, which she did not have in any simple accessible form, the estate being in that liminal state of not yet settled, the house mortgaged, the retirement account still being transferred, her own income from the school district where she worked as a librarian sufficient for living expenses, but not for producing $43,000 in any reasonable span of time. She thought about Howard Sinclair, whose name she recognized. He owned Sinclair Building Supply, a lumber and hardware operation on the edge of Greenfield, the kind of business that had been a fixture in their part of western Massachusetts for decades, a business that Daniel had dealt with in his years of residential contracting work, buying materials on account the way contractors did, building a relationship with the owner over time. She had met Howard Sinclair twice briefly at events where Daniel had introduced them, a Rotary Club dinner and a 4th of July party at someone's house years ago. She remembered him as a large, quiet man with the specific economy of movement of someone who had spent decades doing physical work, who listened more than he spoke, who had shaken her hand and said nice to meet you, and meant it in the simple way that some people mean simple things. She had not called him, not right away. She had sat with the file for 3 weeks, adding it to the already considerable weight of everything that the first month of widowhood required her to carry, and she had made a decision that she would not contact Howard Sinclair until she knew exactly what she was going to say to him, which meant until she knew exactly what she was going to do. What she was going to do had taken 9 months to figure out, and it had required, in those 9 months, decisions she would not have made if any other path had been available to her. She had sold the house. This was the largest and hardest decision, made with a specific and terrible clarity once she had done the mathematics and understood that the equity in the house was the only way to both settle the estate properly and pay what Daniel had owed. She had not sold it quickly or desperately, but she had sold it, the process taking 11 weeks and involving 3 offers before she accepted one, moving into a 2-bedroom apartment. On the other side of town that was adequate for one person and considerably cheaper than anything that would have required her to explain to her children why she had spent their potential inheritance on a debt their father had left behind. She had told them she was downsizing for practical reasons, which was true, and had not told them about the promissory note, which felt like the right decision and also like a form of protection she was extending to Daniel's memory, keeping the complicated parts of him contained in the places where she had to manage them herself, rather than adding them to her children's already considerable grief. She had sold Daniel's truck, a transaction that had taken 2 weeks and that she had handled through a dealership because she could not manage the specific difficulty of strangers coming to the house to look at it. She had sold the boat that had been Daniel's primary joy for the last 8 years of his life, a 22-foot center console he had named the Ruth Ann after her, which she had not been able to look at without crying since he died, and that had been, practically speaking, an expense she could not justify maintaining on a librarian's salary alone. She had sold other things, the furniture that would not fit in the apartment, The tools from Daniel's workshop that she could not use and that his 2 sons from his first marriage had not wanted. Tools that had gone to an estate sale on a Saturday in October and that she had not been present for, because she had known she would not be able to watch strangers pick through the things her husband's hands had held. The levels and the squares and the measuring tapes that had accompanied 30 years of his working life. She had, at the end of 9 months of this work, $39,000. Not $43,000. She was $4,000 short, and the $4,000 was the gap between what she had been able to produce and what the promissory note required. And she had spent 2 weeks staring at that gap before deciding that she was not going to be able to close it by any means available to her that she was willing to use. That borrowing the $4,000 from anyone she knew felt like replacing one debt with another that would carry different and more personal complications. She had decided instead that she was going to go to Howard Sinclair with what she had and tell him the truth and ask if he would accept $39,000 as settlement in full. She drove to Sinclair, building supply on a Wednesday morning in December. It was cold. The western Massachusetts winter already settled into the hills, the sky the flat white of a day that might produce snow by afternoon. She had dressed carefully, not formally, but with the specific intention of presenting herself as what she was, a woman who had taken the matter in front of her seriously and had done everything within her power to address it. She carried the manila folder with the promissory note inside, along with a cashier's check for $39,000 that she had obtained from the bank the previous afternoon, the act of obtaining it having produced, in her, a specific and complicated feeling. The feeling of having converted the physical substance of the life she and Daniel had built together into a number on a piece of paper. Sinclair Building Supply was a working business on a Wednesday morning. Forklifts moving in the yard, customers at the counter, the specific organized energy of a place that operated on practical necessity rather than sentiment. Ruth found the main office through a door marked administrative, a room with 2 desks and a window looking out at the lumber yard, where a woman in her 50s was working at a computer. Ruth asked for Howard Sinclair and was told he would be a few minutes. Please have a seat. Would she like coffee? She did not want coffee. She sat in a chair near the window and watched the lumber yard and thought about Daniel, who had walked into this business hundreds of times across the years of his contracting career, who had stood at the counter and ordered materials and loaded them into his truck with the specific physical confidence of a man who understood the tools of his trade. She thought about the promissory note, about the fact that Daniel had borrowed $43,000 from this man and had not told her, had made and then apparently abandoned a repayment schedule without ever discussing it. And she sat with the complicated feelings this fact produced. Feelings she had been sitting with for 9 months and had not yet resolved into anything cleaner than a mixture of love and grief, and the specific bewilderment of discovering, after 31 years of shared life, that there were rooms in a person you thought you knew that you had never been inside. Howard Sinclair came through a door from the yard, still in his work coat. A big man in his late 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the large, work-roughened hands she remembered from the 2 previous occasions she had met him. He looked at her and said her name, Ruth Callahan. Not a question, but a recognition, and she understood that he had known she was coming before she arrived. That her name in the appointment book had told him what the visit was likely to be about. He took off his coat and hung it by the door and sat down across from her. And she told him she was sorry to take his time, and he said, "Please do not apologize for that." She told him she had found the promissory note in March after Daniel died. He said he had suspected she would find it eventually. She asked him if he had thought about coming to her. He said he had thought about it many times. She asked why he had not. He said he had decided to wait, that the first year after losing a spouse was not the time to arrive at someone's door with a financial claim, that he had believed she would come when she was able, and had not wanted to be the thing that made a hard year harder than it had to be. Ruth sat with this for a moment. She thought about the 9 months of selling and calculating and deciding. She thought about the specific quality of restraint required of a man who was owed $43,000 to wait in silence through someone else's grief rather than arriving with a legal claim. She thought about this carefully, held it for a moment, and then set it aside, because what she had come to do required a different kind of attention than gratitude, at least initially. She had not come to receive anything, she had come to pay something, and she needed to do that part first before anything else could happen. She told him she had $39,000. She took the cashier's check from the folder and set it on the desk between them, pushing it toward him slightly. The way you push something across a table when you need the other person to understand that it is meant for them. She told him it was everything she had been able to produce from settling the estate, that she was $4,000 short of the full amount, that she understood he was owed the full amount, and that she was not asking him to forgive the difference without acknowledging that it was real and that it was a gap she had not been able to close. She said she was asking if he would accept $39,000 as settlement in full, and that if he could not, she understood, and she would find a way to pay the remaining $4,000 over time. She said all of this in the level and careful voice she had been rehearsing for 9 months, not a voice that asked for pity, but a voice that presented the facts of a situation as clearly as possible and trusted the other person to respond to the facts rather than to emotion. Howard Sinclair looked at the cashier's check on the desk. He did not pick it up. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she had the sense, sitting across from him, that he was doing some kind of internal accounting that she was not privy to, measuring something she could not see on a scale she did not have access to. Then he picked up the cashier's check, holding it in both large hands, and he tore it in half, cleanly, deliberately, without hesitation, the way you do something you have already decided to do and are simply now performing the physical act of. Ruth watched this happen without fully understanding it for a moment. The specific unreality of watching something you spent 9 months producing destroyed in a single motion. She had sat across from this man prepared for almost every possible response to what she had brought him and had not prepared for this one. She looked at the 2 halves of the check in Howard Sinclair's hands, and then she looked at his face, trying to understand what she was seeing. He looked at her across the desk for a long moment, the torn check still in his hands. Then he said he was not going to take her money. He said it in the same simple, direct way that she had always remembered from their brief previous meetings, without elaboration or performance, the way you say a thing you have already decided. He said Daniel had been a good man who had hit a difficult patch in his business several years ago and had come to him because he did not know where else to go, and that Howard had lent him the money because Daniel was the kind of person worth lending money to, and that Daniel had clearly intended to pay it back, as the payment schedule in the file suggested, and had equally clearly hit further difficulties that had prevented him from doing so. He said that a man's debts did not automatically transfer to his widow, not legally and not morally, and that he had no interest in taking $39,000 from a woman who had spent 9 months selling her house and her husband's truck and his boat to produce money that Howard did not feel he had any right to. He set the 2 halves of the cashier's check on the desk between them. Ruth looked at them. She said she did not understand. She said the promissory note was a legal document, that Daniel had signed it, that it was a real debt. He said he knew it was a real debt. He said he was choosing not to collect it. He said that was his right as the lender, the same as it was his right to pursue it would have been if he had wanted to. He said he did not want to. She asked him why. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his own wife had died 4 years ago, that he understood what the first year looked like from the inside, and that he had made a decision, sometime in the year after she died, that he was going to try to be the kind of person his wife would have recognized, the kind of person who did not collect debts from grieving widows. He said his wife had been a more naturally generous person than he was, the way some people are just built with more give in them, and that trying to live up to what she would have done had become, in the 4 years since her death, the closest thing to a purpose that the remaining part of his life had offered him. Ruth was quiet for a long moment after he said this. The lumber yard was still visible through the office window. a forklift moving steadily between stacks of timber, the ordinary business of the day continuing outside while something else entirely was happening in this room. She thought about 31 years with Daniel, about the specific way grief worked, the way it did not diminish so much as change shape over time, becoming less like a wound and more like a new weather system you learned to navigate. She thought about what it meant to lose a person, and then try to figure out how to continue in a way that honored what the person had been without turning that honoring into a kind of paralysis. She understood, sitting across from Howard Sinclair with the torn pieces of a cashier's check on the desk between them, that she was in the presence of someone who was doing exactly the same work she was doing, trying to maintain a connection to a person who was gone by making choices that the gone person would have recognized and would have approved of. She said she was not sure she could accept this. He said she did not need to decide today. He picked up the two halves of the check and put them in his desk drawer. He said the debt was considered settled as far as he was concerned, that she should not spend another day worrying about it, and that if she found at some point that she wanted to do something with the money she had saved, she should do something that felt right to her, something her husband would have been glad to know she did. She drove back to Greenfield through the flat white December sky, and she did not cry until she was home, and then she cried for a long time, sitting in the small kitchen of the apartment that was not her house and never would be, but was where she lived now. The specific cry of someone who has been holding something together through sheer will for 9 months and has just been given permission to let it go. Not just about the debt or the money or Howard Sinclair, but about all of it. About Daniel and the boat called the Ruth and the workshop tools that strangers had carried away on a Saturday in October, and about the 31 years that had ended in a hospital room in February, and about the specific and ongoing work of continuing to be yourself after the person who knew you best was gone, after the person who made the house feel like a house rather than a structure you inhabited was simply no longer there. She sat with the $39,000 for 3 months, not spending it, not moving it, letting it sit in the account where she had assembled it while she thought about what Howard Sinclair had said about doing something that felt right, something Daniel would have been glad to know. Daniel had, across 30 years of residential contracting, done a specific kind of work that Ruth had always known about but had never given adequate weight to in her accounting of who he was. He had taken on, regularly and without particular announcement, jobs for people who could not fully pay for them. A widow whose porch needed rebuilding, who had been navigating the broken steps for 2 winters because she could not afford the repair. A family whose roof was failing who did not have insurance for the job. A retired teacher on a fixed income whose furnace room needed critical updating for safety reasons. He had charged these people what he felt they could pay. Sometimes very little, sometimes nothing at all, and he had covered the difference himself, absorbed it into the margins of other jobs, and he had not talked about it because it was not the kind of thing he considered worth talking about. It was simply part of how he understood the work, part of the basic ethic of the trade as he had come to define it over 30 years. Ruth had known this about him. She had known it and not fully reckoned with it, and then found, going through his business records across several evenings in the months after his death, a process that had taken longer than she expected because there was more there than she had anticipated, evidence of it running through 20 years of invoices, the specific pattern of a man who had built something like a private subsidy into his own business, quietly and consistently, for as long as he had been doing the work. She called Howard Sinclair in March, 3 months after the December meeting, on a morning that had a quality of early spring that still felt mostly like winter, the ground still frozen but the light different, a change in angle that promised something without delivering it yet. She told him what she had been thinking about for the 3 months since she had sat in his office, and she told him what she intended to do with the money. She was going to establish a small fund, administered through the town's community foundation, specifically for home repair assistance for elderly and fixed-income homeowners in the county, people who needed work done that they could not afford to pay for. The same category of people Daniel had been quietly helping for 20 years without anyone knowing about it, the people who fell through the various gaps between what assistance programs covered and what they actually needed. She was going to call it the Daniel Callahan Fund. Howard was quiet on the phone for a moment after she told him this. Then he said Daniel would have hated that. She asked what he meant. He said Daniel would have hated having his name on it, that from everything he knew of Daniel Callahan, the man had done every generous thing in his life, specifically so that it would not have his name on it. She said she knew. She said she had thought about that, had considered naming it something else, something more anonymous. She said she was putting his name on it anyway, because this was one of the few decisions left that she got to make for him, and she had decided, after thinking about it for 3 months, that people deserved to know that this kind of help existed because of the kind of man he had been. Howard said he thought that was the right call. He asked if the fund could accept contributions. She said it could. He made the first contribution that same afternoon, transferring the funds before the end of the business day, a number she had not expected and that she sat with for a long time after she saw it, enough to extend the fund's projected life by several years, given without fanfare and without any communication beyond a brief note that said simply, "For the fund." Given in a way that did not require acknowledgement, the way he apparently did most things. The fund began making its first grants in the spring. The first recipient was an 81-year-old woman on the east side of Greenfield, whose back steps had rotted through and who had been navigating her own home through the side door for 8 months, because the front entrance was no longer safe and she could not afford to have it fixed. A woman who had lived in the same house for 47 years and who had been too proud to tell anyone about the steps until a neighbor noticed and mentioned it to someone at the community foundation who mentioned it to Ruth. A local contractor repaired the steps and rebuilt a section of the railing over the course of 2 days in April. He sent Ruth a photograph when it was done. The new wood bright against the old paint of the house. The railing solid, the front door accessible again. The woman did not know where the money had come from. She knew only that someone had paid for what she needed. Ruth stood in the parking lot of the Community Foundation office on the afternoon the first grant was approved. A Thursday in April with real warmth finally in the air, and thought about Daniel, who had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of thing, quietly and without putting his name on any of it, in the specific and unhurried way of someone who simply understood that this was part of the work and did not require a separate accounting. She thought about Howard Sinclair tearing a cashier's check in half in December, and about the 4 years he had spent trying to live in a way his wife would have recognized. She thought about the specific and ongoing work of honoring people who are gone, not by preserving them in amber or building monuments to them, but by continuing the thing they started, by carrying forward the quiet and unglamorous effort they made before anyone was watching, by making sure that what they built with their lives did not simply disappear when they did. She thought that this was what grief eventually became. If you let it, not the weight of absence, but the shape of what you carried forward, the specific continuation of someone's best intentions, extended into a world they were no longer in, but that was still in the ways that mattered most, being shaped by what they had done and who they had been while they were here. Before you go, I want to leave you with one thing. Howard Sinclair did not have to tear that check. He was owed money, real money, with a legal instrument to back the claim, and a woman was sitting across from him with the check in her hand. He tore it anyway, because of a decision he had made 4 years earlier about what kind of person he was going to try to be in the years he had left. And Ruth Callahan took $39,000 she had, spent 9 months assembling through sacrifice and used it not to replenish what she had lost, but to carry forward what her husband had been doing quietly for 30 years. Both of them made choices that were not required of them. Both of them made choices that were shaped by the people they had loved and lost. This is, I think, one of the truest things I know about grief. It does not have to make you smaller. If you let it, if you decide to let it, it can tell you exactly who you want to be. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life, gone now, whose example you are still trying to live up to? Tell me about them. I want to know. And if this story carried something you needed to hear today, share it with someone who is carrying their own version of this weight. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.